first time. And so, look, I mean, what this means is that things are moving a lot more quickly than I think a lot of us have thought. There's still been this idea that the two sides are having meetings, they're having negotiations as to whether or not the president will sit down formally for a voluntary interviews. And of course, we saw last night the 49 or so questions that the Mueller team is prepared to ask. But this appears to be now on the table, the idea that a subpoena could be issued to force the president if he doesn't sit down for a voluntary interview.
What was the tenor of this negotiation between Mueller and the president's legal team? Was it cordial or did it become tense?
Well, it appears, at least according to one of the sources who talked to my colleague Gloria Borger, said that this was a very tense meeting simply because John Dowd had a very sharp response to the idea being that this would interfere with the work of the president. And this is something obviously the president's legal team takes very, very seriously. And this is why they believe that, this should never even come to this. Even the idea of an interview, they believe, interferes with the work of the president because obviously he's preparing for a summit meeting with North Korea. This is something they keep bringing up as one of the many reasons why doing this would interfere with the president's work.
Earlier, the Washington Post was reporting that, according to their reporting, that the president is now thinking of not going for an interview, not complying, that he doesn't think it's a good idea. Is that what you're hearing as well?
That is exactly what we're hearing. I think it's become abundantly clear that the president's legal team is getting ready for a standoff, really, on a subpoena, because if a subpoena does come, there is, I think, a lot of thought inside the president's legal team that this is a line that the special counsel cannot cross, that this is something that they might fight all the way to the Supreme Court. In their view, at least according to the president's lawyers, they believe that the special counsel doesn't have the power to force the president to go before a grand jury basically under compulsion. So I think this is something that if it comes to this, if Mueller does indeed issue a subpoena, then we're going to be looking at perhaps a year of litigation, appeals process, and then all the way to the Supreme Court. Look, I think it's something that the Supreme Court has previously said presidents can be subpoenaed, but the circumstances here are a lot different from some of those previous cases.
Yeah, Evan, thanks very much. Appreciate it. I want to go now to Jeff Zeleny at the White House. Jeff, you talked to a lot of people. The White House attend a lot of the press briefings where the question of a subpoena has come up many times. What exactly is the public stance the White House has taken on this?
Anderson, the public stance is that the White House today was actually being more disciplined than I've seen them really any time I can remember. They were referring all questions to the president's lawyers. But the reality here is this. The president has said repeatedly he would like to sit down with the special counsel, but the also competing reality here is that could not necessarily be good for him. So as Evan was just saying there, this is something that the president has said constantly he wants to get this over with. The White House wants to get this over with. In their view, before the midterm elections this fall, if they dig in and resist an interview, a sit-down, this will extend it much beyond the midterm elections into, potentially next year. Now, there's a mixed view of thinking here. If the president doubles down and says that this is, a witch hunt, a fake investigation, would that help him with his base? But they know, legally speaking, he wants to get this over with. So in the coming days and even weeks, the president will decide if he wants to sort of, roll the dice and sit down with Bob Mueller's team or not. He said he has wanted to. He wants to. He says he's had nothing to hide here. We'll see if that happens, Anderson, because going on and on and on here, legally, there's a lot of peril for him to do that.
Yeah, Jeff Zeleny, appreciate it from the White House. With me now, Professor Alan Dershowitz, Asha Rangappa, Ann Milgram, and Michael Zeldin. Professor Dershowitz is author of the new book, Trumped Up, How Criminalization of Political Differences Endangers Democracy. Professor Dershowitz, do you think this is heading toward a subpoena?
I do. I think we may be seeing some posturing now. We may be seeing some attempts of both sides to flex some muscles. We're going to give you a subpoena. Oh, yeah? Well, we're going to do this or that and the other thing. It may still end up with a narrow 4-hour or 6-hour conversation between the president and the special counsel.
You think they can do it in 6? Because those 49 questions.
That's the whole point.
That seems like days.
That may be a negotiating position. Because if you are doing those questions, what's the possible benefit for the president to sit down? The only possible benefit the president gets by volunteering and giving up his rights is if he can narrow the questions, he can refuse to answer questions in certain areas. But if they're going to ask him about everything, might as well take it to the courts and fight.
But isn't there a slight advantage, Asha, that if he's not in front of a grand jury, his lawyers can be present and can involve themselves in this?
Right. So he'll have his counsel there. And I think it also, you know, he can still narrow the scope or refuse to answer certain questions as they're asking follow-ups, for example. The questions that are laid out are big, broad brush questions, right, and each of them will generate follow-up questions. But I think that we need to remember that this presidency is kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure where every ending ends in a constitutional crisis of some kind. The ideal situation is that he sits down and does it. I do have to agree with Alan. It's probably not in his interest because he does not have a command of the facts or the discipline to answer in the way that he should.
And Jeff Toobin in the last hour suggested Jeff thinks he would take the fifth, and that would eliminate all this problem. Professor Dershowitz said absolutely no way he shouldn't do that.
I don't know that I think he takes the fifth either. I think it's incredibly perilous for him to take the fifth. I mean, essentially he said, I have nothing to hide. I'll have the conversation. To then take the Fifth Amendment basically says that he would be incriminating himself if he spoke, and he would be basically saying that he's guilty of a crime. And so I think, you know, that's more of a political question, but I think that is probably the least likely option that he's going to want to go through.
Mm-hmm. Michael Zeldin, do you see this heading toward a subpoena?
If they don't reach an agreement, I think that's where Mueller will take it. You know, my time with Bob tells me that he believes that his mandate here is to find out what happened, and that he's going to follow the facts to find out whether those facts lead to law violations or not. And that the president is not going to dictate to him the terms under which he does his fact-finding. Remember that on the team that Mueller has is Michael Dreeben. Michael Dreeben is one of the most accomplished Supreme Court criminal appellate advocates. I expect the issue of whether or not the president can be subpoenaed to give oral testimony has been well briefed by Dreeben, and that Mueller feels that he's on solid legal ground to make that request to Dowd at the time known, that they will follow that route.
Mm-hmm. Professor Dershowitz, though, I mean, to Jeff Zeldin's point, if this does go the way to the courts, this could go on for a year.
Well, it could go on for a year. I suspect it first gets to the district court, and the district court splits the difference. And the district court says you must answer questions about your business dealings before you became president. You must answer some questions that you may have waived or other areas. But there are going to be some questions about your motives, your reasons, your intentions, that the court will probably say is beyond the power of the grand jury. Now, the interesting question is whether or not the argument that I've made, that is, you can't call a subject into a grand jury in order to give him an opportunity to commit perjury. You have to do it in order to get information you don't already have. Whether that kind of argument will prevail, it could go both ways on that.
But Asha, don't prosecutors all the time ask questions that they know the answers to?
That they precisely ask questions that they already know the answer to. And I think that I disagree with Alan. They need to get his answers on motive, because that is precisely on what the obstruction case turns. It's whether what he was thinking when he fired James Comey and what happened before and after. And we have this litany of actions, including his own tweets and interviews, for him to explain. So I don't see how you could shield that.
It's relevant, but it's also privileged. You know, you can't ask a senator or a congressman to explain their vote. You can't ask a judge
Nixon says that if it's not privileged, if it's not a legitimate policy decision-making or national security related, if it's evidence of a crime, if it's evidence of a crime, it can be pierced.
Would they have asked President Bush why he gave a pardon to Caspar Weinberger when the special prosecutor said that pardon to Caspar Weinberger and 5 others was motivated by a desire to end the prosecution and continue the cover-up? Everybody agreed with that, but everybody also agreed you can't ask the president that question. The president if he has the authority to do something, has the authority to